Have you heard about the Ethiopian Holy Book? Most people haven't. This isn't just another version of sacred writings. It's a collection that challenges everything we thought we knew about faith history and how religious powers have shaped beliefs over time. It remains one of the most mysterious, disputed, and influential texts ever created, yet few in the Western world know its true significance or the powerful truths it contains. While most folks know about the 66 books in the Common Bible, the Ethiopian Holy Book contains 88 books, including writings deliberately left out of Western faith traditions. These extra texts, like Enoch, Jubilees, and other excluded works, contain knowledge that church leaders considered too risky for ordinary people. But why? What was so threatening about these books that they were removed from mainstream faith? To understand this, we must explore history, religious politics, and hidden truths kept from us for hundreds of years. Truths that could transform how we understand our spiritual heritage. The holy book that came before the common version. When most believers think about sacred texts, they picture the familiar 66 books found in standard versions. However, long before the famous English translation appeared in 1611, another version already existed with 88 books instead of 66. This ancient text, still used today, is the Ethiopian Orthodox Holy Book, preserving writings that Western church leaders removed, banned, or deemed too controversial for the masses to access. The Ethiopian Holy Book is among the oldest and most complete religious collections in existence. While Catholic and Protestant versions underwent many changes over centuries, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept a broader and older collection of sacred writings. Many books found in this collection, such as Enoch, Jubilees, and Apocalypse of Peter, were once widely read by early believers but later excluded from Western traditions through deliberate acts of theological censorship. This holy book's importance goes beyond its contents. It shows a faith tradition that grew independently from Rome, offering a glimpse into early beliefs before European influences reshaped them. Ethiopia's connection to this faith is much older than most realize. While many European nations didn't adopt this religion until centuries after its founding, Ethiopia was among the first countries worldwide to embrace these beliefs, creating an unbroken tradition that continues to this day. By the 4th century, the Kingdom of Aksum had already declared this faith its official religion, long before many parts of Europe. Historical records suggest Ethiopia sheltered early believers fleeing persecution, becoming a sanctuary for those practicing the original form of the faith. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its beginnings to Philip's conversion of the Ethiopian official in the Book of Acts, an event that happened before the spread of faith throughout the Roman Empire, a fact that challenges the Eurocentric narrative of religious history. Unlike Catholic and Protestant traditions, heavily influenced by Roman and Greek theological debates, Ethiopian faith developed independently, preserving texts and traditions that Western churches later abandoned in favor of more politically convenient interpretations. By the time the English king ordered a new translation in the early 17th century, multiple versions already existed with varying numbers of books. To unify religious practice and strengthen his authority, the king authorized a translation that would establish which books belonged and which didn't, a decision driven as much by politics as by spiritual concerns. The books they didn't want you to read. The Ethiopian Holy Book preserves entire books erased from Western faith, offering a glimpse into beliefs once widely accepted but later suppressed. These lost texts contain prophecies, heavenly revelations, and accounts of supernatural beings that challenge conventional understanding and the power structures that benefit from simplified religious narratives. The Book of Enoch describes fallen heavenly beings, giants, and detailed visions about Judgment Day and the fate of both good and evil people. It provides extensive details about the spiritual realm that go far beyond what remains in standard texts. Despite being referenced in accepted texts, it was removed, suggesting early church leaders feared its influence on religious teaching and its potential to undermine their authority as the sole interpreters of divine will. The Book of Jubilees, also called Little Genesis, retells early stories with additional insights missing from traditional versions. This book introduces heavenly laws, divine secrets, and ancient calendar systems that differ from mainstream beliefs. It presents a structured view of history following divine patterns rather than human whims. Its removal suggests certain details about creation and divine law were considered too complex for ordinary believers or too threatening to established power structures. The Apocalypse of Peter contains vivid descriptions of heaven and punishment, describing how spiritual forces interact with the physical world. This book reveals insights into unseen beings and heavenly realms, giving a broader perspective on unseen dimensions. It also contains prophecies about the birth and mission of the Savior, offering descriptions that differ from standard accounts. These differences raised questions about which version was more authentic, questions that powerful religious authorities preferred to avoid by removing the text entirely. As we explore these hidden writings, we must ask what truths were lost and how faith would look today if these books had remained included. Would believers have a more direct connection to divine mysteries? Would religious institutions hold less control over interpretation? These questions strike at the heart of how faith has been shaped by those in power, how the Holy Book was censored and rewritten. The sacred text we know today results from centuries of careful selection, translation, and revision, a process driven not only by faith but also by political and theological goals. Many assume these writings remained unchanged since their creation, but historical evidence reveals a complex process of deciding which texts were divinely inspired and which should be rejected, with powerful figures often making these decisions based on what best served their interests. Books presenting conflicting stories, alternative teachings, or warnings about the end times were systematically excluded from the official canon. The Book of Enoch, for example, was widely read by early believers and even quoted in accepted texts, yet because it described fallen heavenly beings, giants, and supernatural revelations, it was later removed from Western collections. Similarly, other texts that presented alternative views or challenged emerging doctrines were carefully filtered out of mainstream tradition. This process of selection and exclusion wasn't simply about preserving the most authentic texts. It was about creating a version of faith that aligned with the political and social structures of the time. By controlling which books were included, authorities could shape how believers understood their relationship with the divine and with earthly powers. This raises an important question. If these writings had remained included, how different would faith look today? Would it be more diverse, more mystical, more challenging to earthly authorities? The African roots of faith and the true image of the teacher. For centuries, Western religious traditions have depicted the central figure as European, with fair skin and features that reflect European ideals rather than historical reality. This portrayal has been so deeply embedded in religious art, literature, and teaching that many overlook the African influence on faith and the teacher's actual appearance as a man of Middle Eastern and likely darker complexion. This misrepresentation isn't merely aesthetic. It has profound implications for how faith has been understood and practiced. By depicting the central figure as European, Western traditions have subtly suggested that Europeans have a special claim to religious authority, while distancing the faith from its origins in Africa and the Middle East. This visual theology has been used to justify colonialism, missionary activities, and the suppression of indigenous spiritual traditions. Contrary to the myth that faith was brought to Africa by European missionaries, Ethiopia and Egypt were strongholds long before Europe fully embraced these beliefs. By the 4th century, Ethiopia had already declared this religion its official faith, making it one of the first nations to do so. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved traditions that predate many Western religious doctrines, including sacred texts removed from later versions and practices that reflect the faith's original context. The Ethiopian Holy Book challenges the notion that faith belongs to one culture or race. It reminds us that the earliest believers came from diverse backgrounds across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The descriptions found in these texts, including the Book of Revelation, which describes the teacher as having hair like wool and feet like burnished bronze, suggest a man with features more common to people of African or Middle Eastern descent than the European image that later became standard. Faith was never meant to be exclusive or tied to one cultural expression. It has always been deeply connected with Africa and the diverse peoples of the ancient world. Now it's time to reclaim that truth and recognize how political forces have reshaped our understanding of religious history to serve particular interests rather than historical accuracy. Why was the Ethiopian Holy Book really banned? This collection is one of the oldest and most complete sacred texts in existence, containing 88 books, including texts deliberately removed from Western versions. These missing books reveal prophecies, heavenly histories, and divine laws, offering deeper understanding of spiritual matters that go beyond the simplified narratives preferred by institutional authorities. These books were considered dangerous because they gave believers direct access to divine mysteries, reducing the need for institutional control and interpretation. They presented a more complex, nuanced understanding of spiritual reality that couldn't be easily managed or used to support political structures. By the time the English king commissioned his famous translation, Western faith had already undergone centuries of modifications designed to align religious practice with political authority. The removal of key texts helped create a more controlled European-centered version that aligned with political structures of the time. Books that emphasized direct spiritual experience, divine justice for oppressors, or alternative understandings of religious history were systematically excluded, creating a version of faith that was more compatible with colonial expansion and monarchical authority. In contrast, the Ethiopian tradition preserved these texts, maintaining a connection to the earliest expressions of faith. This preservation wasn't merely academic. It represented a different understanding of the relationship between believers and divine truth, one that emphasized direct access rather than mediated interpretation controlled by authorities. The Ethiopian Holy Book was never just about faith. It was about power, control, and shaping history to fit specific narratives. By removing key texts, church and political leaders ensured that religion evolved in ways supporting their authority rather than empowering believers with full understanding of their spiritual heritage. This process of selection and exclusion has shaped how billions understand their faith, often without realizing how political forces have influenced what they believe to be divine truth. Now that these lost books are being rediscovered, we must ask what we've been missing. The Ethiopian Holy Book reveals a richer, deeper, and more complete understanding of faith, history, and divine justice, one that challenges many assumptions that have become central to Western religious traditions. The origins of this collection date back to the earliest days of the faith, with many scholars believing it was established around the 4th century when Christianity became the official religion of the Aksumite kingdom. Written in Ge'ez, the ancient ceremonial language of Ethiopia, this holy book has remained largely unchanged over centuries, making it one of the closest surviving links to early religious thought and practice before European political interests reshaped the faith. While Western faith evolved through councils, reforms, and political pressures, Ethiopian traditions maintained their original form, preserving practices and texts that were gradually altered or removed in other traditions. This preservation offers unique insights into how early believers understood their faith before European influence reshaped it to align with imperial ambitions and political structures. Beyond its religious content, the Ethiopian Holy Book stands as a symbol of resistance and spiritual independence in a world where faith was often used as a tool of colonization. While European colonialism spread a version of faith that erased many African influences and indigenous traditions, Ethiopia remained one of the few African nations never colonized. Its distinct tradition remained untouched by Western imperialism, allowing it to serve as a powerful spiritual and cultural anchor for African identity and religious autonomy. At the heart of the Ethiopian Holy Book lie 3 particularly controversial revelations: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Kebra Nagast. Each presents a powerful narrative about divine justice, historical destiny, and Ethiopia's unique role in faith history. These weren't mere religious writings. They were statements of spiritual authority and resistance that challenged the foundations of political and religious power established by European institutions. Few religious texts have been as controversial as the Book of Enoch. Once widely accepted by early believers, this book describes fallen heavenly beings who taught humans forbidden knowledge, giants who roamed the earth, and detailed visions of Judgment Day that go far beyond the simplified accounts found in standard texts. For rulers seeking to maintain control over their subjects, these teachings were dangerous. They suggested that earthly powers would eventually face divine judgment regardless of their status or claims to authority. The Book of Enoch presents a cosmic drama where justice ultimately prevails over oppression, where the powerful are held accountable for their actions, and where divine forces actively intervene in human affairs. This vision of spiritual reality challenged the more orderly, hierarchical understanding preferred by religious and political authorities who wanted to position themselves as the mediators between heaven and earth. While the Western version presents history as a chaotic sequence of events, often requiring interpretation by authorities, the Book of Jubilees reveals a structured divine timeline, challenging human control over historical narrative. This text teaches that history follows a divinely orchestrated plan. All struggles, especially those of the oppressed, are part of a greater purpose. Justice will come even if it takes centuries, and no earthly power can prevent the fulfillment of divine promises. For colonial rulers and religious authorities seeking to justify their dominance, this was a dangerous idea. Jubilees gave hope to the oppressed and warned the powerful that their actions would face judgment regardless of their earthly success. By removing this text, Western authorities could more easily present their own power as divinely ordained rather than temporary and subject to higher judgment. The Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, tells the story of how the Ark of the Covenant came to Ethiopia through Solomon and the Queen of Sheba's son. This text establishes Ethiopia as the true heir to ancient promises and the new chosen land, preserving the most sacred relics and traditions of the faith. It presents an alternative history where Africa, not Europe, becomes the center of divine activity and spiritual authority. For European powers claiming religious authority and using that authority to justify colonial expansion, this was a direct threat. It countered the idea that African nations were meant to be ruled by foreign empires and suggested instead that Ethiopia had a special divine destiny independent of European control. The Kebra Nagast provided a powerful counter-narrative to European claims of religious and cultural superiority, establishing Ethiopia as a nation with its own sacred history and divine purpose. Together, these three books present a faith that is revolutionary, uncompromising, and deeply connected to justice. They tell a story empowering the oppressed and holding the powerful accountable, a message Western religious institutions worked tirelessly to suppress as they aligned themselves with imperial powers and political authorities. Yet despite centuries of efforts to erase these texts, they survived, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as a testament that no institution is above divine accountability. The suppression of the Ethiopian Holy Book was deeply tied to colonial expansion and European reshaping of faith to serve imperial interests. During colonial times, European empires sought to erase African traditions and impose Western religious structures that supported their political and economic dominance. Faith in its European form became a tool for subjugation rather than liberation, teaching obedience to earthly authorities rather than divine justice for the oppressed. This process wasn't merely about theological differences, it was about creating religious systems that supported colonial power structures and justified the exploitation of non-European peoples. By removing texts that emphasize divine judgment, cosmic justice, and the special role of African nations in religious history, European authorities could present their dominance as divinely ordained rather than as human exploitation that would eventually face judgment. Even today, many religious institutions remain silent about the Ethiopian Holy Book and its implications for how we understand faith history. Why? Because acknowledging it means confronting uncomfortable truths about how modern churches were shaped by political and colonial interests, rather than purely spiritual concerns. This collection reveals that many books were removed not for theological reasons, but for political control, a reality that challenges claims of divine guidance informing religious traditions. The Ethiopian Holy Book reveals several uncomfortable truths. Justice and accountability, rather than blind obedience, are at the center of divine plan. Faith is not a European religion, but has deep African roots, and many religious doctrines evolved not through divine revelation, but through political manipulation of sacred texts. These truths challenge the foundations of religious authority as it has been established in Western traditions. For 2,000 years, billions have placed their faith in sacred words, believing them to be direct messages from the divine. But what if today's version differs significantly from the original? What if core messages about salvation, divine justice, and human purpose were altered through centuries of translation and political interference designed to support particular power structures rather than preserve original meanings? The journey of these texts through history is marked by power struggles, political calculations, and theological biases that have shaped how we understand spiritual truth. Unlike what many assume, these writings weren't translated directly from original languages into modern versions in a seamless, neutral process. Every translation has been shaped by its era, often reflecting religious, social, and political agendas of the time, rather than simply preserving ancient wisdom. Understanding how these texts have been altered forces us to ask difficult questions. Are we reading the true original message, or just what translators, rulers, and religious institutions wanted us to believe? How many of our core beliefs are based on errors, misinterpretations, or deliberate alterations rather than the original teachings? These questions aren't merely academic. They strike at the heart of how we understand our spiritual heritage and relationship with the divine. If this exploration has opened your eyes to new possibilities, don't keep this knowledge to yourself. Subscribe to our channel now to receive regular updates as we continue to uncover the real story behind these ancient texts. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest revelations about the Ethiopian Holy Book and other suppressed religious truths. Share this video with friends and family who deserve to know the complete story of their faith heritage. Join our growing community of truth seekers who refuse to accept simplified narratives when the full truth is so much more powerful and liberating. Remember, knowledge that isn't shared remains powerless. By subscribing, commenting, and sharing, you become part of a movement to restore the complete spiritual heritage that has been kept from believers for centuries. The truth is waiting to be rediscovered, and together we can bring it back into the light where it belongs. Subscribe now, because the journey to true understanding has only just begun.